exciting success story, and really appreciative of the speaker who's joining us. His entity Bitbond has created a great reputation, and a lot of yeah, they've done some really cool things. And we have Radoslav Albrecht, who's the founder and CEO of Bitbond, joining us to talk about a use case on how ABN Amro Bank, very large name in global banking, especially in Europe and other parts of the world, how ABN Amro issued tokenized corporate bonds on the public blockchain. I think it's almost 10 years since he founded Bitbond. So congratulations, Radoslav, on the 10-year anniversary. In his previous life, he worked as a management consultant for a very prestigious consulting company, strategy consulting company in Europe. So very excited to have you on. I think this is a great use case. I think brings great value to everyone. I'd like to turn it over to you.
Great, Tanvir. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about tokenization, and then specifically, of course, about the ABN transaction. I would briefly introduce what we do at Bitbond, how we look at tokenization, and then elaborate a bit on the particular use case with ABN Amro, which I'm glad that you let me talk about it, because I think it's a great example of how tokenization can be brought into capital markets, and what are the benefits that it can bring. To introduce Bitbond a bit, we are a technology company, like Tanvir mentioned. We've been up and running for 10 years now. It's crazy how fast time is running. We originally started with a slightly different business model, but today, and since about 4 years, we focus on providing tokenization technology. We are an infrastructure provider, primarily to financial institutions and issuers of tokens who want to configure tokens, launch tokens, and manage the lifecycle of tokens. When we work together with banks such as ABN Amro, we often also provide professional services, mainly consulting around strategy and technological questions related to tokenization. Often there is a connection to custody, for example, because those entities who want to issue and manage tokens will often need to also safekeep them. And so there's a very close connection on a technological level between the custody part and the tokenization part. And so on the one hand, we have our proprietary tokenization product, and on the other hand, we support banks and larger clients when they plan and implement tokenization related projects. The product that we have is called Token Tool, and it's an asset agnostic infrastructure that lets you create tokens and manage them. The term asset agnostic is relatively important to us, because the way we look at tokenization is not asset class by asset class, but we want to provide an infrastructure that can be used across different asset classes. One of the reasons for that is when you tailor the infrastructure from asset class to asset class, you don't realize as large economies of scale as you could, and your relative costs are simply bigger. And the way we make that work is that with our product Token Tool, you can configure tokens and can configure them in all kinds of ways, so that these tokens can represent securities such as bonds or stocks, but they can also represent fund shares, and they can also represent all other kinds of illiquid assets, and be digital twins of vintage cars, art, and other real-world assets as well. The way we make this work is by supporting different token standards. You may have heard of the ERC20 standard, of the ERC 1400 standard, which is primarily used in the context of security tokens, or the ERC 721 standard, which is used for NFTs or so-called non-fungible tokens. And you can use the product in order to configure them and launch them and manage the lifecycle. One last comment about the lifecycle management, and then I'm going to talk about in much more detail about the ABN transaction. Lifecycle management means that throughout the token lifecycle, there are events such as corporate actions where you may need to do something with the token. A very simple example is, let's assume the token represents stocks. Then you have a capital increase, for example, which means that the number of outstanding shares is being increased. In such a case, you need to mint additional tokens. So you need to interact with the existing token smart contract, as it's called. You may also have a capital decrease, in which case you need to decrease the total token supply, which is a technical process called burning. Then there is payments that happen throughout the life cycle of an instrument such as a bond. You may have coupon payments, you may have dividend payments in the case of a stock. And when you have an on-chain payment method, such as a stablecoin, for example, then you can actually use smart contracts in order to automate these payments. With that, you can replace the function of a paying agent, which typically conducts its work in a relatively manual way. But you can formalize all of that in a smart contract, which then allows you to trigger those payments in an automated way, collect them from the issuer who needs to make the payment, and distribute them to the investors who are entitled to receive these payments. And so we provide smart contracts that allow you to do all of that. And now coming to the ABN Amro transaction, we are going to look at a concrete example, how that can play out in practice. First of all, as an introduction, ABN Amro is one of the largest banks in the Netherlands, and among many other successful and large business lines, they are very strong in debt capital markets. So they work with a lot of corporate issuers, for example, which they help to raise funding, debt funding primarily, in the public capital markets. And we've been in touch with ABN AMRO since nearly 3 years now, and we have presented to them what tokenization means, what are the benefits of tokenization, and they got quite excited about it early on. And so we started to work together on a transaction. And what ABN AMRO did in a first step is they did several internal workshops to understand the implications of tokenization better, which business units does it touch, and what would it look like in order to implement an actual transaction. Then they decided to do an internal pilot because typically as a bank, you need to do a lot of risk mitigation. You need to understand the implications of new processes very well. You need to test it. And so the decision that they made was to do an internal pilot first, which I personally believe is a very good way to do that, because on the one hand, you cannot do everything based on slide decks. You sometimes need to actually, implement stuff. At the same time, you want to limit your risk exposure and do internal things first. And that's the way a lot of banks are approaching tokenization and in general technological transformations. They would do a pilot, and when that is successful, then move on to a real transaction that involves real money and real clients. And so about a year later, after we started to work with ABN AMRO, they've completed this internal pilot. They did a bond that was issued by ABN and also invested to by ABN. However, that already helped them to answer a lot of questions, such as what kind of legal implications does a tokenized bond have? What legal framework can we use in order to issue this tokenized bond? How is the treasury process? How do we settle the payments? Do we do that on-chain? Do we do that off-chain? What mid-office and back-office functions need to be involved? So plenty of questions came up, and that's also the reason why it took several months to actually complete this internal pilot. The good news was that the pilot was completed successfully, and most of the questions that were supposed to be answered actually were answered with that pilot. So as a next step, ABN AMRO decided to do a, so to speak, real transaction with a client of the bank. And they have chosen one of their corporate clients called APOC, which is a aviation part out company that was in a fundraising process anyway, and they decided to do a tokenized bond. So they again went through a legal evaluation, but also a lot of technological questions needed to be answered, which is where our primary role was in that project, to provide guidance and ultimately the software that is necessary in order to launch a token. The transaction that they did was a 400,000 euro tokenized bond by this corporate client of ABN AMRO called APOC. The bond was purchased by several institutional investors. These institutional investors were highly interested in gaining first-hand exposure and experience in investing in tokenized assets. And so it was a win-win situation. ABN Amro have already conducted the internal pilot. The issuer was interested in gaining access to innovative ways of raising capital from investors, and the investors wanted to understand the investment process of a tokenized financial asset in a better way. Maybe a few more technical details. As a blockchain, in this particular transaction, Stellar has been selected. Part of the decision goes back to the early days when ABN Amro started to look into tokenization. Back at the time, there weren't really good scaling solutions to Ethereum, which of course is the dominant blockchain when it comes to tokenization. However, one of the goals of the transaction was to achieve the highest level of efficiency that's possible. And back at the time when we went through these decision-making processes, Stellar was one of the best blockchains to use when it came to settlement speed and low transaction fees. Of course, by today, this has slightly changed. At Bitbond, for example, with our token tool, we support 7 different Ethereum compatible chains, Ethereum itself, of course, and Polygon and many others, and also Ethereum compatible private chains. At the same time, we also still support Stellar. There are still situations where Stellar is a very beneficial protocol to be used, and such was also the case with ABN Amro. I think these are the main points that I wanted to mention about ABN Amro, and maybe we still have 2 or 3 minutes for questions, and if that's the case, then I would be more than happy to take questions now.
We'll try and take at least one question, Radoslav. Let me see if, let me monitor the chat right now. And while we do that, yeah, in the future, would love to see you and Stellar come back and, you know, and we'll allocate more time. I think this was a good start.
Absolutely.
I did not see any questions unless I'm missing at the end. Also, we are at the end of, you know, the 10 minutes past the hour. So I'll let them, if anyone has a serious question, I'll let them try and connect with you through your LinkedIn or through social media. That's
absolutely
okay.
No
and
problem.
feel free to post. You can post your handle before you leave. That will be great. And I know it's fairly late in the evening in Europe, in Germany. So appreciate you joining us today.